Okay, so this is the beginning of the recording. And hello, Dan, and hello, Peter. We've
Hello.
we're recording this kind of conversation or little interview with you guys because the Triple Focus just came out in Danish. And as you know, I wrote the foreword, and you wrote a comment for the foreword, and I was very pleased with that. And immediately when I shared it on my Facebook profile and other places, I've been called by all kinds of newspapers and people who want to do interviews and want to hear more about this. So there seems to be a lot of momentum and interest in Denmark growing. I'm very pleased about that, of course, this being my home base. So, and as we see you being a little pixelated, Dan, maybe if that continues, you should just go on voice and not have the image.
I'll do that.
Okay. So now we have a very quiet version of you. Okay, so what we wanted to talk about today, actually the publisher in Denmark asked if we could perhaps do some kind of conversation or interview with you guys about how you see the triple focus and the particular Danish context of the educational system here coming together, and if you see a good match. And of course, you can talk about the triple focus in general more than you can talk about the Danish context, and I'll be happy to fill in the blanks with the Danish context. So, any thoughts on that?
Peter, you've been there. Perhaps you could start.
Sure. Well, there's two things that came to my mind as soon as you posed the question, Mette. The first is, obviously, Denmark has a very good school system, but everybody's schools, in some level, in my personal opinion, are struggling to keep up with how rapidly the world's changing. And the immediate symptom of that is the kids, the students, really aren't very engaged often. That said, in Denmark, you have some wonderful innovations in, I think, what's typically called in Denmark empathy education, particular very sophisticated approaches to social emotional learning. They're probably not nearly as widespread as they could be, and probably the quality is somewhat uneven, which is very natural in the early stages of things like this. But I've certainly met enough of the educators and seen enough of the work to know that there's some of the most sophisticated work in the broad social emotional learning domain. Even though they often maybe don't use that word in Denmark, I think they often call it empathy education. Secondly, the whole systems perspective, in my experience, a lot of the smaller Northern European countries, because they're small and they're situated in the midst of a lot of other countries they have to pay attention to, they actually get that often in a very particular way, a little different. I'll just contrast it with our country, the United States, which is so big and has inherited over the years this mindset that we're the center of the universe, which is not a very useful mindset for cultivating a systems orientation. But if you're quite aware that your fate depends on a lot of other things going on all around you, let me just take, for example, the immigrant crises all over Northern Europe today. It's a perfect example of realizing that your country's situation is always being influenced by actions of people outside your country. That's a good predisposition for a systems view. It doesn't mean you've necessarily developed that systems view, and oftentimes what occurs is a kind of defensive, how do we protect ourselves? But the first condition of being aware that there are a lot of other forces outside your boundaries that are really important, and having that, you might say, in your cultural DNA is a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
I would add to that. I've been to Denmark many times, mostly on holiday, actually, not to observe schools. But I think that the Danish culture is quite unique in terms of its potential receptivity to the triple focus, because Denmark has a record, a really amazing track record of being very cutting edge in innovation. You see it in Danish design, you see it in the way society operates there. I often see Denmark and say so, Denmark and a few other Scandinavian countries as real models, for example, in terms of speaking to economic inequities, which is systemic throughout the world. I think that Denmark and other Scandinavian countries have the most optimistic model about that. And also the emphasis on community and fairness in Danish culture. And seeing that everybody gets an equal opportunity, equal share. I think that those values make Denmark uniquely receptive to what we're trying to do, which is add to the academic curriculum what Peter is referring to as social emotional learning, which are things like self-awareness and being responsible for your own emotions, empathy training, as Peter said, and I guess that's the term, social skill. And then on using that in the service of working together and to understand and work within systems and to change systems, because Denmark, like the rest of the world, is raising a generation of children who over their lifespan are going to deal with very ugly systems, really. For example, the Paris meetings are going on as we speak, and the climate concern is paramount in a lot of minds. And that is something that can only be handled systemically. It's only by understanding the contributing factors, which are worldwide, built into our economics, into our manufacturing and retail systems, the entire economy. Only that kind of systems view is going to help us cope with that. And the other thing on many people's minds these days is terrorism, which has to do with a kind of what should we say, a cultural virus. And that too is systemic. And I don't know where the solutions will come from, but they'll have to include an understanding of our own emotional world, other people's emotional reality, cultural reality, and the systems within which all of that is operating. Wouldn't you agree, Peter?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It's interesting, this perspective, Dan, because one of the things that really stand out now, I've been visiting all these different schools in many different countries now, and that one of the things that really stand out in the Danish schools is this sense of the equality is taken right into the classroom as well. So there's a kind of an anti-authoritarian disposition in kids, and among kids and teachers, this equality and respectful communication. So thinking about that, even though that can become a little challenging, because when little kids really have a lot of self-respect, that you cannot just go about and treat them in any old way. But would you think that is kind of a place where the natural cultivation of the triple focus can grow from?
I think that cultural value is one that's very supportive of the triple focus. I think it's a natural foundation in a way for helping every child develop at these three levels, because these are our capacities that kind of level the playing field, that help children make their way through life in the best way possible, no matter where they started out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll just add that in those educational cultures or educational systems that are highly authoritarian, in other words, very teacher-centered, which is most, the thing we always struggle with is real innovation in pedagogy and instructional design. Because you can have all these great ideas, but giving a lecture on what kids should do to be more aware of themselves by a teacher who isn't perceived by the kids as being very aware of her or himself, and is just telling them what to do, is such an obvious contradiction in terms that, of course, the kids get it right away, and it has very low credibility. And the same is true from of the systems work. We learned long ago, as we watched the systems thinking tools start to infiltrate many different educational settings, where they took root was where they were done in concert with real innovation in instructional design and pedagogy. And I would say the heart of that is what you talked about in terms of this mutual respect. For teachers to stand and give a lecture about here's how the system works, again, it will have no credibility. because all they can ever talk about is models and ways of thinking about it. But to say, hey, terrorism is really complex. None of us know how to really understand it systemically. But here's some ways to approach it, and let's work together to try to understand the complexity and where there might be leverage in different settings. It's the only pedagogy that's really credible.
And in fact, the triple focus is really the opposite of an authoritarian approach, because it respects the student and it has faith in the student, and it places the nexus of learning inside the student,
Right.
and wants students to express that, to work together, to share, in other words, to use these outlooks, these tools, these constructs to cooperate and to learn together, to work together, and not to look to a teacher for authority necessarily, but to become that authority.
Yeah. And what goes right along with that is that to really have an educational design or an educational context in which teachers and students are all learning together. I heard it expressed beautifully by a master teacher developer person, Mette and I have worked with some, who comes out of our network of some of the master systems teachers. And she said, it's not about what the teacher knows. The teacher has to be perceived by the students as working to cultivate the same capabilities the students working to cultivate. Obviously, the teacher is maybe a little further ahead in certain ways, or certainly more familiar. But it's that spirit of we all actually are in a lifelong journey to develop our emotional maturity, our sensitivity to self and others, our awareness of the larger systems we're part of. That's what I meant by a credible pedagogy.
Mm-hmm. Interestingly, the municipality that we're beginning to work with, we're sketching out a prototype to figure out how we can, implement the triple focus perspective into the wonderful work that they're already doing. They're kind of a pedagogical innovative hotspot, and they would like for all of us to come together and collaborate around talent, but talent in the sense that everybody has something that they can unfold and develop, and they would really like to teach precisely that. So could you perhaps say a bit about how the triple focus could be beneficial for such an approach?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say I love that
I do too.
sensibility about talent, because it doesn't say this kid is talented and those kids aren't. It says every child is talented in his and her own way. And let's help that child cultivate, sharpen, hone, grow that talent. And I can see a few ways in which the triple focus could be an aid. One is that, as my old friend Howard Gardner expressed in his 7 kinds of intelligence, it's not all about academic learning. There are many ways to be a talented individual. You can be emotionally talented. You could be socially talented. You could be musically talented. Each of these different ways of expressing your abilities requires, for example, some self-management, some discipline. It takes work to increase a talent, and that means managing yourself. It also means meshing that talent with the people around you, with other kids. Peter, can you go from there?
Well, yeah, the one thing that I was really thinking about as I was listening to you there is that, and society needs that. So if we look from the outside in, what are the talents that our societies need? Not just in the future, but even in the short term. We could even say today, as well as I think more and more in the future. They're not just the traditional academic talents. I have more experience working in businesses than schools. So for most of the history of developing all the organizational learning work and systems thinking, applied systems thinking work was in a business context. I will guarantee you, I don't know any business today who doesn't really look for people who are going to be good at working in teams. So that comes back to awareness of self in the context of others, the ability to listen, the ability to empathize, the ability to work together on really complex things. And, traditionally our schools didn't emphasize that much. So I think there's actually a big mismatch between the traditional ways that education has been focused in the schools and what actually is needed in our societies. And of course, we can extend that today to cultural understanding, the ability to work together on truly complex issues like what Dan was saying, to using climate change as kind of the archetypal example, terrorism. I don't think any of our societies, if I can be honest, we don't fret about the ease with which our populace can be manipulated by demagogues. We all have that problem. There's a lot of fear. These big complex issues are showing up on our doorstep, literally. And so in that setting where there's a lot of fear and anxiety, the demography, political people trying to pursue an agenda with a quick fix to a complex issue can gain a lot of power. And to me, it's an educational problem. If we have societies that are easily manipulated by people with quick fixes to truly complex problems, then it is a failing of our education system. So to me, the big gap here is between what our societies need and what our education system is producing.
Perhaps you can say just 2 words about the way you use the word quick fix, which is really a systems archetype or model.
Well, any, sentence that starts with the answer is, right? What we need to do is, we need to build bigger walls to keep the immigrants out of our country. First off, there are problems that are pretty simple, but there are a lot of problems that aren't so simple. There was a great American writer who once said, for every complex problem, there's a simple answer, and most of them are wrong. Right? So I think that the sensibility to really tackle non-trivial problems, I'll call them non-school book problems, the right answers in the back of the book. There's no right answer for raising your kids. There's no right answer for being a good son or daughter of an aging parent. There's no right answer for most of the real problems of life. But that doesn't mean there aren't more and less effective ways of dealing with them. So this tendency to go for quick fixes is always almost one of the kind of iconic demonstrations of non-systemic thinking. And that's why I've always been a big fan, for example, of classic liberal arts education. I found a lot of the most effective business people, when you really look at their background, oftentimes they have backgrounds in classic liberal arts education. They learn to think. They learn to tackle non-trivial problems that don't necessarily have the solution. And a lot of times we run into problems where people who grow up in an overly technical education, which has been overly focused on the answer, actually struggle enormously when they get to a position in an organization where they're no longer dealing with problems that have simple converging answers. So yeah, it's really a fundamental issue. And I've always thought ultimately it's an educational issue.
Mette, I'd like to ask you a question.
Mm-hmm.
You're deeply familiar with the Danish culture, the educational system, and you're very enthusiastic about bringing the triple focus into play there.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts about it? Why do you think it will make a difference?
Well, thank you for asking. I've come to understand over this period of time where we've been working together on the triple focus that it's really about finding the places where people kind of speak the same language or already in advance know that this is part of the solution for creating a more sustainable future for our kids and for ourselves, of course, and our future generations. And I sincerely believe that it's completely necessary to have all 3 focuses because, when people are highly emotional intelligent, there's always the shadow side to it that, it can become almost neurotically self-aware and you're all the time kind of only focusing inwardly. So that needs to be balanced with the social competences. So in where you are as focused on the other as you are on yourself, more or less, or at least have the ability to be that. And on the other hand, when people are more socially intelligent in the sense that they are constantly kind of a bit out of themselves to be there for others, it's an unbalancing and ungrounded position to be in. So it's not very resilient for people who are like that. So when we're facing these complex issues, that balance needs to be upheld. And the question Peter often asks is, but how does that help you, solve climate change? And so from the emotional and the social kind of understanding, it needs the triangulation of also relating to the larger collective, really being standing in relation to the larger group, the larger system, the family, the classroom, the school, the community, or the global kind of planetary system. And it's a continuous process. So it works from inside out into the social and then out into the larger field. And I think that there is something, as you both point to, the kind of the degree of freedom and equality we have here. There's this immense level of trust in society and immense level of trust in kind of community. I mean, I live in the middle of Copenhagen, and often I forget to lock my door in the middle of the night and my kids have been riding their bikes around since they were 7, and I never ever worry about where they're at. I mean, that's just, when I speak with my American family about that, they think I'm a crazy, super irresponsible mom. And that level of trust creates kind of a surplus of energy, I think, that you don't have to invest too much in anxiety because we're kind of safe. And that's a very, very rare position to be in our world today. So from that surplus energy, I think this cultivation process that the triple focus can really forward when relating to all 3 domains can actually grow here kind of from a very, very deep perspective. And I think it could, to some extent, be a new Scandinavian model or the new Nordic model of schooling or education. This, if we really take this seriously, this is something that we could brand ourselves upon for future generations. I mean, I think that the timing is there and the potential is there. So I'm just hoping that we'll see some benefits. But let me ask you then, Dan, what would be a good way to, I mean, if I'm a leader, for instance, of a school or a school district, a municipality leader, someone who really wants to see this happening, what would be a good way of initiating such a process?
Well, I think first you have to mobilize your allies. I don't know how decision-making operates in the Danish system, but in other parts of the world, it's complex. It's never one person's decision. You need to get a group, like-minded group. Mm-hmm. And I think that having, for example, a pilot place that you can go to observe, see this in action is very important. I'm glad you have one place at least that you're starting this. But I also think that talking about it, spreading the word, letting people, for example, see the book, letting people see demonstrations, will let others realize that this is something that really serves kids. And that I think the most powerful way to think about it, at least for me, is something you've said and Peter has said, which is that this is the kind of education children need to prepare themselves for the future, because it's going to be a very different kind of future. It's going to be a much more challenging future. It's going to be a high-risk future, high promise, but high risk. It may be a more threatening world. I mean, Copenhagen, I've been in Copenhagen many times, a very safe feeling as a city. But the world around is not so safe, and it's seeming less safe. And I think that this skill set, particularly if it could become nationwide, as Peter suggests, would make Denmark far more robust and resilient in the next 20, 40 years. So I see this as an investment in our children's future and your children's future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you have a comment on that, Peter?
I couldn't agree more. I guess I would have just added, therefore, our society's future. There's an old saying in traditional Chinese culture that the hallmark of every golden age is the children are the most important members of society and teaching the most revered profession. And I always think what that saying is communicating is that when you really are focusing on the well-being of the children, you're focusing on the future. And I think the one thing that's really distinctive today is what Dan's mentioned. We all know we live in a disruptive era. So to focus on the well-being of the children, which kind of anchors us emotionally, has to be done simultaneously with holding this immense ambiguity and dimensions of disruption. I mean, there are certain aspects of it we can kind of talk about, at least in general, with high level of confidence. We know that our societies will need to come into a different degree of balance with the larger ecological realities, period. You know, the old joke in ecology, you know, nature bats last, to use an American metaphor. You know, that humans are not ultimately in control. We have to live in harmony with the natural world. We know there are a lot of changes that will have to happen in that regard. In that sense, climate change is nothing but the most visible symptom of this. We know that the world's getting smaller. We know that human beings will need to learn to live in harmony with all our diversity of cultures, religious systems, and economic realities. We know that the economy that we have today in the world privileges a few and creates enormous disadvantages for others. We know these things will have to change. We don't know the specifics. But to sit around and say, hey, we can kind of educate kids the way we have in the last 50 years, and that'll be just fine, we just do it really well, it is totally irresponsible. We know that kids are the ones who will actually be solving these problems, if they get solved at all. So that's a very kind of a spirit of education that has to infuse all of our societies. And it is our collective responsibility. We can't just point fingers at teachers, because teachers can only do so much. If there isn't a public consensus to support creating real pockets of innovation in education, it won't happen.
So what you're saying is it's not about the planet's future, it's really about the future of our species.
The planet's just fine. The planet's been around for a few billion years, likely to be around for a few billion more, but species come and go. And ours is actually quite young.
Yeah.
Well, let me just end on a positive note, which is to say, given the challenges ahead, I think it's a stronger argument than any for incorporating a triple focus into education.
Yes, yes. And, you know, when you see it done, the kids, you know, like they go, at last, you know, this is the education that I know is going to really speak to the needs that I have personally, as well as my society. So the thing that's always hardest to convey in these kind of interviews is when you're around these schools, when you're around schools that are genuinely respectful and really helping kids develop their social, emotional, and systemic intelligences. It's really exciting. You know, the energy is palpable. So yes, it's important to recognize the problems, but it's also, as you said, Dan, I really like the phrase, we live in a time that's high risk and high promise.
It reminds me a bit, Peter, of the very first kind of tiny little prototype we had when the Triple Focuses just came out, and we were working with a bunch of Danish kids and teachers and asking for an evaluation at the end of the day. And the first guy put up his hand, he was like, I'm 17 years old, I've been going to school for 11 years, this has been the best day of my life. So we took that as a kind of a positive, you know.
Yeah.
Okay, then maybe you would put on your the video again so we can see it's actually you.
It's me.
You're there.
It was me.
It was you. It wasn't just me kind of mimicking your voice.
And it's been a pleasure to join you both. I'm glad we could do it from our...
Yeah, I'm glad we could make this work. Thank you both.
Thanks.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.